and welcome to Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. It's been a while since our last episode. Eldon's been pretty busy with school, and I had my partner out visiting for a couple months, and you'll hear from her in this episode. So Valentina, we interviewed a few episodes ago when we discussed Reiki and compared it to priesthood. And so, Valentina and I were together, and so I took a little break from podcasting. But about a week or so ago, Valentina had me on her podcast. She runs a podcast, Stories of Awakening, which essentially discusses people discuss their spiritual awakening, which, I think has a different definition to each people, but in generally, I think is coming to a true understanding of the nature of reality, really the sense of who we really are, ego, death, and understanding who our true identity is as awareness, source, whatever you want to call that. Her podcast is great. I guess Mormon stories, but instead of deconstruction heavy and an emphasis on a specific faith tradition, it's more just kind of contextualization or reconstruction or transcending the spiritual, religious, cultural, career paradigms and structures that people have in their life, often through trials and difficulties, divorce, job, career switches. Her podcast is Stories of Awakening. It's on Spotify and YouTube. And she had me on, and we discussed my story, which I talked a bit about in, I think, episode 6 of this podcast, where I shared a bit of my story, and we compared it to a journal article study on people who went through what they would self-classify as a spontaneous spiritual awakening or a Kundalini awakening. And so I shared a bit of my story and how similarly, compared to what they found in that study. But this is more the longer version of kind of my faith, spiritual, scientific, philosophical arc throughout my life. So it's a little difficult sharing this, and it feels very vulnerable. But I guess what comes to mind is people have this concept of, like, I've heard people talk about, don't put your, within a religious context, pearls before swine. But I've never really jibed with that idea, because a bit of that sounds elitist and as though the other person isn't prepared or able to comprehend or understand what whoever's saying that would share or has experienced. I think some of that's a cover for that person not really being able to really integrate and explain what they experienced, which, within mystical experiences makes sense. I think there's also some understandable hesitation. Historically, people that have had mystical experiences sometimes suffered persecution, whether it was from the church, through, the purging of Gnosticism or, heretics, or even today through the Western pathologization of spiritual experiences as psychopathology. So it feels a little weird, vulnerable to be sharing it, but I think it's important important because right now we've kind of just lumped all of those mystical, spiritual experiences just in the category of religion and spiritual experiences that happen within a religious context generally, or within psychedelic experiences, which we often just dismiss as hallucinations or things that we can explain from a physiological perspective. But there's not a lot of integration or explanation of how those experiences, what philosophically, scientifically, logically, what they mean. And as someone who came from a really scientific and logical background, having degrees in, the hard sciences, bioinformatics, computer science, and not having many experiences within religion, it was pretty difficult for me to integrate those two and make sense rather than have them in these kind of two dichotomies of like there's a spiritual belief and then I have like a physical, logical day-to-day belief. It took a while for me to integrate those two together. And that narrative is slowly becoming more well-known, I think, with scientists like Bernardo Kastrup and Donald Hoffman, people that are integrating science and spirituality. But it's still not a very prominent narrative. But I think that is important for people to see that there is a logical and scientific explanation for these experiences. And I think it's increasingly important because we have really bizarre things like the UAP, the UFO stuff that's coming out, the disclosure that's being pushed for. We have these concepts such as UAPs, even the idea of consciousness and AI. What are some of the bizarre things that they're finding in quantum physics and medicine and psychedelic research? We're being faced with a lot of concepts that we really don't have a way to integrate into a cosmology unless we open ourselves up to idealism, or the idea that consciousness is fundamental and that matter arises through consciousness. So idealism, non-duality, these more Eastern philosophical cosmologies, I think is really important. And that's ultimately how I integrated my experiences that you'll hear me talk about into science. And I don't talk too much in this interview about the scientific integration. More of that you'd find in episode 2. So it's a little light on that. This is more kind of my just kind of the overall arc and the actual experiences I had. Because this is another thing that I find is lacking, is that people, they talk about mystical experiences and oneness, whatever, but they don't actually explain like what really does that look like? What did you experience in that moment, in that experience? Even with people talking about those psychedelic trips, they'll talk about different things, different experiences they have, but they don't actually often talk about what actually happened in that experience, which I find fascinating. So I think that's important. We can talk about mysticism, mystical experiences, non-dual experiences, and the high level concepts. But really, I think it's helpful to not beat around the bush like, the general authorities and apostles of the church often do when they're asked about whether they see Christ. There's some teasing there rather than actually coming out and saying like, hey, this is what I've experienced, this is what I haven't experienced. And so I think that's important because it's interesting, but it also helps normalize these experiences for other people. Because people have had some pretty bizarre experiences, and it's so bizarre that it's very easy to integrate them poorly, and that's where I see a lot of these people that have moved into really extreme beliefs, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, or even not so much extreme beliefs, but Denver Snuffers movement. I fully believe that he experienced what he says he experienced. It's just really interesting hearing him talk about those and realizing like, oh, this really fits into the research on mystical experiences. And he's not aware of it. And if you're not aware of it, you're just viewing it through the lens of Christianity and in particular Mormonism, this idea of the second comforter, rather than realizing, oh yeah, this is happening to Buddhists, and they're seeing, or Hindus and seeing Hindu gods, Buddhists maybe seeing Buddha, I don't know, or other people in there, they're seeing an alien or whatever that experience, however that experience manifests within their beliefs system. So yeah, hopefully you enjoy this, or at least find it fascinating, interesting. And so I will play Valentina interview with me from her podcast, Stories of Awakening.
Welcome to another episode of Stories of Awakening podcast. It has been a while because I was away for a couple of months and I didn't record anything. If you follow me on Instagram, you might know that I was in America because, well, I went there to visit my partner that lives over there. And today I have him with me as a guest. So welcome, Gabe. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
How are you? Is it
Good.
weird? It's weird for me interviewing you for my podcast.
Yeah, it's we've been talking about this for a long time, and so it's good to finally be doing it.
Yeah. So Gabriel has a very interesting story, and I'm sure it can help many people. And so, Gabe, I would love for you to share as much as you want about your story and your process of awakening. And if you want, also say what does it mean awakening for you.
So I guess awakening means understanding the true nature of reality, which also is intrinsically linked to understanding our true identity, because that's a crucial shift in it, is that we go from identifying with the ego to identifying with an expanded sense of self. And yeah, so start from just kind of setting up the wounds, the things that led me up to it. So I was thinking, childhood wise, a few different factors. So I was raised in Pennsylvania. I was raised Mormon and got 4 brothers. And so I'm in the middle of 5 boys. And so there's a few things that I think set me up for this trajectory and to have this shift in awareness at this point. So I guess Mormonism was a huge part of that. So I was really active, Orthodox, really by the Book of Mormon up until about 7-8 years ago. But Mormonism, there's a lot of good things about Mormonism, but it's very very strict in terms of their rules about morality, and like most religions, everything's set up right, wrong, good and evil. So I think a lot of people end up with wounds in relation to Mormonism's teachings about morality. So no premarital sex, but specifically, really heavy emphasis on modesty, which is as big of a deal for guys, but for women, it's like your body affects how other people think, and so like you're responsible for other people's emotions. The body is kind of shamed for also strict prohibition against masturbation, and so that ends up being just causing this guilt and shame for a lot of people in Mormonism. So you have this, and really strict, even rules about like you're not supposed to date until you're 16, you're not supposed to exclusively date, single off until ideally until you're late teens or getting ready to marry. No French kissing. So a lot of just scenarios where you can have a lot of guilt and shame and feel like, oh, I'm not worthy. I've done something that Satan tempted me, etc. So I had this really black and white thinking from Mormonism too, because I didn't have a lot of self-worth, from my childhood. And so my self-worth was derived from following rules. And if I followed the rules, I was good. God loved me. And if I didn't, not that he didn't love me, but it's kind of like his hands tied behind his back. These are the rules that he has to follow. So very poor attachment figure in religion, specifically Mormonism. So that's kind of the Mormon set of things, like family-wise. We didn't have a fairly dysfunctional family. My parents both went through their own struggles in childhood, and my mom did a lot of things to shift things in a healthy direction. Her mother was pretty concerned about what other people thought of her in the family, kind of appearances, and who would tell my mom, tell the kids, you guys better change your underwear, because if we get in a car crash, like I don't want you guys to look like I don't take care of you or something. And so that was like, oh, like the biggest concern is not us and the car crash and how we're doing, but it's like what other people think of us. And so that was a conscious effort that my mom shifted of, I don't really care what other people think. I'm going to do the best for the kids. But still pretty difficult home life, and Mormonism was kind of tied into that. My dad was excommunicated from Mormonism for his own kind of religious, spiritual ideas, ego inflation. And so a lot of tension over that and separation different times. And so I had a really tough time. I had really strong emotions as a kid, both in like the positive and the negative. So, I remember really being, really having a lot of empathy and, crying when I saw these videos about, for $1 a day, you can save these kids, or you can, help these kids in these other countries. I remember coming to my mom just in tears, just because I felt like for their suffering. But also, I was very volatile and, would really have these outbursts. My parents weren't emotionally available to help regulate me. And so I remember, police being called once to restrain me. And then I think after one incident, I think I did something, pretty dangerous, through something really dangerous at one of my brothers. My mom just didn't know what to do. And so was taking me, I think I had had an evaluation before, but at some point she was going to take me to stay inpatient at a psychiatric hospital. And I was pretty young, I think, under 10, somewhere between 5 and 10. And Phil Haven is the place. And so I just remember, begging her and being, very like this was, I was felt, I was being abandoned, and also that this, like, there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that I was kind of this monster. And so, yeah, I remember begging her not to, and eventually, she didn't. I think we may have gone, but she ended up leaving me there. And so, and then she said, I shaped up after that, which I realized in the last couple of years, it's like, oh, that was, I adapted towards dismissing attachment, of like, oh, these strong emotions aren't safe. And so I just need to turn them off after a certain level and adapt in that way to stay safe. And that was a pattern that I brought up, is just kind of not feeling things over a certain threshold. But I was installed with this idea of, like, I was this monster. I was a really good student, and my teachers really loved me. I did really well at school. But I remember thinking, like, oh, if my teachers knew who I was at home, they would think differently of me. And so this is, this imposter syndrome, that I have ADHD too. And so that's kind of a common thing with ADHD, is this imposter syndrome. It's like, oh, if people really knew me, or how hard I worked, or whatnot to, like, get this, then they would think differently of me. So yeah, a lot of shame and guilt of just who I was, feeling kind of broken. And this is like, Judeo-Christian religion teaches us to, is, man is fallen because of Adam and Eve. Or Mormonism, they have a positive view of Adam and Eve, but, like, inherently we're fallen, we sin, and it's only Christ, that can save us. And so that contributed to that as well. And yeah, then, I think
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Mhm.
So, I know many other people might be fascinated by this. In terms of rules, other than the one that you mentioned in Mormonism, did you have rules also about what to wear, what to eat, how many times you need to go to church, some stuff like that? What time you need to get, what time, when you need to get married and stuff like that?
Yeah, we did have some rules that were kind of imposed by my dad, in terms of, he didn't want us eating meat or sugar. And so that was from him, and that did contribute to, like, me just not learning how to, if somebody else makes decisions for you, you never learn how to self-regulate yourself. And so you either fully abstain, or you kind of go out of control of it. So, and the same thing happened with us for, like, video games. Like, we weren't allowed to play video games because we just, like, fought and everything. So it's like, no video games. And so, yeah, I wasn't really able to learn just how to have a healthy relationship. The same thing with, like, I didn't view any, very, very little, like, pornography growing up. But that's another thing that I realized, that people that were raised out of religion, is like, oh, they should have, like, a healthy relationship with healthy sexuality, porn, masturbation. But in Mormonism, it really caused an issue for people because it's viewed as so harmful. And then whenever people mess up, which that's a pretty common thing, They get this guilt and shame, and then addiction, happens in this cycle where we do something to alleviate that guilt and shame. And so in terms of rules from church, we did go to, it's fairly intensive for church, and it's like 3 hours. It was 3 hours on Sunday. But it wasn't like not necessarily a super strict Orthodox religion, like, some forms of Judaism.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. I was curious. Don't think I asked you this question.
Oh, yeah. And then I think the last thing that I'll share, kind of personal, but as I've talked to other people, part of overcoming my shame, which was a huge part of my healing, was sharing things that I felt shame about, and then surprised at how many other people had similar experiences. So I remember being a parent of got a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old, I realized like how just healthy and normal these things are. So I remember as a kid, I was probably 5 or 6 or something, I had a best friend, and at some point we were just exploring our private parts, little kids, particularly boys, but boys and girls, like, it was a part of growing up development. And my mom somehow like found us, and she talked to me about gave me the talk about how we don't do that, etc. But I remember just feeling so much shame if I had done something so wrong. And I get, this is what happens, particularly when you're in a religion that's hyper focused on morality and sexuality. And so that was something that I just thought about often over the years of that was a sin, but it was like before I was 8 years old, which is like when you're accountable in Mormonism, but I just still felt, so shameful about that. I remember, being in my 20s, dating people and feeling like, I need to this is something I need to share and disclose with them. Because what would they think of me, And so shame, at least for me, was a huge part of just my lack of self-worth, which I had to overcome when I healed. So I think that was the main kind of setup in my childhood of not having self-worth and deriving my self-worth from following rules and also excelling in school. So I did really well in school, and I learned that I was good, not because I existed, but because I followed rules, because I excelled at doing things, some perfectionism.
Mm-hmm. And then you said you left the church 8 years ago, something. So what was the process there?
Yeah. So so bring up to that point. So along this path too, with shutting down my emotions, having not feeling really safe in childhood, realizing I really needed to keep myself safe so I didn't get abandoned. I became very, very left-brained, analytical. If I could, the side of me that had emotions and that were feeling and that were chaos, that was scary and unsafe. And so if I could just logic things out and monitor other people's emotions and plan and adapt and turn everything logical, I could stay safe, and it worked. And that was the strength of mine. So it was very, even though I was religious, and there's kind of this, I lived with this sort of split brain where there's a side of me that hoped, wanted to believe, told myself I believed in God and the Jesus Christ and this story, the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith. But it really was very separate from most of my brain, which was just science, materialistic. I didn't know the term materialism, but it's this physical world, like we know all the rules, but you know, I would switch into like the believing mode at church or whatnot, but they really weren't integrated at all. And I didn't really have that many spiritual experiences at church. I would feel good, feel like, you know, some deep sense of connection, and like a little peak experiences when we would like have youth camps or you know, those type of activities, but not a lot. You know, some people really have strong, powerful spiritual experiences in religion. I didn't really have that too much, but I kind of, you know, I thought I believed. I told myself I believed. So I went on, you know, went to BYU, which is a Mormon school in Utah, Brigham Young University, and went on a mission. So Mormon men are expected to go on a 2-year mission. Mormon women aren't expected, but they can. So when I was 19, I went for 2 years to Montana and Wyoming, and there I had the strict rules. So really strict rules. I could call home 2 times a year for a few hours each time. You could write home each week, but really it's 6 days a week. You had 1 day mostly off, but 6 days a week you were knocking on doors, teaching people about Mormonism. But even the day you had off, like you still had, that was the day that you did your laundry and your shopping and everything. So you got up at 6:30, went to bed at 10:30. So no dating. You had to be with this other companion, this other guy, you know, really within sight and sound whenever you're outside the apartment. So it's a really, really stressful and really formative period for a lot of people. So on my mission, you know, I was in this black and white, you know, perfectionist. You know, they stress, you know, obedience, like this is how you prove your worth. You know, this is, you know, you signed up and you agreed to this. So I was really strict about all these rules, and so stressful. But I really worked hard, and it was a very stressful, trying experience, but it was really formative. But I learned on my mission that, yeah, forcing people to follow the rules doesn't work, because as soon as they're away from you and they don't have that cast, then, you know, all the muscles there, you know, have atrophied. They haven't developed anything yourself. And so that was an interesting learning experience for that. But so did that, went on that mission, came back, was at BYU, and studied really sciencey stuff, bioinformatics. I was a pre-dental student, dated people, a big emphasis on marriage in Mormonism, marrying, having kids really young. And so a lot of people get married men get married when they come back from mission. So 20, 21, 22, women, sometimes 18, 19, 20. And then they often have kids, you know, very soon after it. And a lot of kids. So, but I was one of the little bit of anomaly. I didn't get married at BYU. And so I went to dental school and met somebody there at dental school, not in dental school, but in Pittsburgh, and got married there, went through dental school. So I got married to a Mormon. We waited a few years until we had kids, we waited several years to have kids. There were struggles in our marriage, you know, largely be from our childhood and from Mormonism. I was much more of a black and white thinker. She was healthier in her view of religion. So that was a stress between us, because again, your salvation and most importantly, your like marriage with another person. Mormons believe that marriage unions can be eternal, but you got to follow all these rules. And so, I finished dental school, started my job in public health in a community health center. And then it was really when we were pregnant with our first kid that I had doubts over the years I'd seen people over the years leave Mormonism. And I always had this really profound sadness because I think my subconscious worried that I would never have that courage to really question and leave if it was just too scary. And so it's sad you're kind of left alone as other people are realizing something and leaving. And in Mormonism, you tell yourself, oh, it's because they sinned or they got offended or whatnot. So eventually we're going to have our first kid, and it was stressful within our marriage. And so I finally, all of the times when I had doubted, I just told myself, like, I approached the doubts of like, okay, well, this is what I really want to believe, what I really want to be true, everything I've built my life on. So how do I find the answers that support that outcome that I want? And you can do that as long as I could find like, well, there is this chance that this was true, this like a few percent chance here and a few percent chance. There's a way to craft the narrative this way. And so I could keep that together. But then for the first time, I had a friend that left, Nathaniel. We were roommates at BYU, and he left Mormonism, and he had posted one day of just a really beautiful, like, hey, I've left Mormonism and life is beautiful. And there's no anger, no bitterness. And it was, it defeated all of the narratives, the scripts that I would have with other people, of like, oh, there's no happiness outside of Mormonism. They just wanted to sin, etc. And so I couldn't have that narrative. And so I was like, all right, for the first time, I'm going to approach this without like the end point decided, and really give myself the freedom to come to whatever conclusion I feel is right. So I'm trusting. It's been a couple months, and just research. I knew most of the things that critics of the church said. So I read things on both sides, and as soon as I opened up myself to the option of not staying in Mormonism, things kind of fit into place. I didn't come to any conclusion of like really what happened in terms of like early Mormonism and all the claims, because there's a lot of claims of miracles and visions, and there's this text, the Book of Mormon. I was like, I don't really know what happened, but it wasn't what the narrative that the church puts out was. I wasn't really angry or bitter. A lot of people that leave, they're bitter because I knew all the things pretty much before, and so I was on me that I stayed. But a lot of people don't know the things, and so, but it was really, really just a lot of grief that I had to deal with, because the whole structure of my belief and existence and what this was all about, and what you can do and you can't do, the rule book, what's right and what's wrong is gone. And when you're raised in a faith that is so prescriptive and tells you everything that you should believe and do, and tells you to, like, oh, if you drink, then like you just lose control, or if if very fear-based, if you wear this type of clothing, or if you French kiss, you just lose control, and you don't have any trust of yourself. And so when you finally have, and I would often think like, oh, thank goodness I'm a Mormon, because if I wasn't, I would be this drug addict. I would do all these things. I would just sleep around, I'd just be this terrible person. So I thought, oh, Mormonism is keeping me good. So when you have all that taken away from you, it's scary, because you're like, you don't trust yourself. And go ahead.
No, I just now nothing to say. It just is hard to imagine how you felt, and I can see there is still some emotional response to that grief that you felt. But yeah, it's like you thought the world was working in a certain way, and now all your belief system, values, and everything collapse. So it must be very scary. Yeah, I think many people feel completely lost.
Yeah, and there's no one, you don't know where to look for answers to. And I remember, so, I thought this would bring me together in my marriage, because it's a big sticking point that I was so black and white. But then I ended up leapfrogging her. And I hadn't really kept her updated in my searching, because I thought that, I'd misread where she was at, and I thought that she was just staying in for me. And then when I was like, yeah, I'm out, that took her by surprise. She's like, oh, I actually still resonate with a lot of these things. I just don't, believe in the rules. And then she's like, well, just keep things together. I'll be out too. But, that was painful for her. But yeah, our whole marriage was built on this too. And so this was just something we didn't really talk about, because it was all scary for me now. I mean, as a kid, I'm weird, and that weirdness goes back to being a kid, because I would think about not existing. Okay, if I die and just then I don't exist, that would be very, I wouldn't like not existing, like, because I would try to think of myself as like being trapped in some like box for eternity, as if you had awareness, as if you would have awareness if you didn't exist. So I was like, that's super scary, because I just cannot comprehend not existing. That does not, it feels like trapped in eternity, in a void. But then I would also think of the alternative, which was what Mormonism taught, which is like, Mormonism is very like esoteric in its teachings. And so they teach that, yeah, you can, the purpose of this is to become like God, to become a God, become exalted. And then you do everything that you believe God is doing, which is having spiritual kids and populating worlds, and basically creating and having worlds. And then your kids, the kids in those worlds, they go through the same process. So it's very fractal like. But I was like, that sounds really exhausting to do that for eternity, because that also felt like a prison, because it's just, what if I wanted to quit someday and like retire from being God? So that was scary. So now I'm like, my belief system is gone, and death was scary. And it was scary, not that I felt like I was close to death, but I had this kid. It was scary to be so close. One car crash, one tragedy where like my ex-wife died, or my kid died, that I just knew would just destroy me, destroy my marriage. So even though it wasn't on the table then, it was scary, because I knew it would catch up to me at some point. I would have to deal with it at some point. So, but I figured that, the one good thing about Mormonism is that, all the other religions aren't true, because you're very it's this very kind of like, well, it's a very logical religion. There's a lot of things that make a lot more sense than mainstream Christianity. And so you learn like, oh yeah, like Christianity doesn't make sense because there's so many people that didn't know about Christ, and like that just doesn't make sense. They would all go to hell just because they grew up in Africa and during this time or whatnot. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to look into any of the other religions because that there's no point there. So I figured, if there was truth out there, then there would already have been a consensus that we would have figured it out as society. And I didn't see any consensus because I was not aware of any actual true spirituality. I didn't know anything about Eastern stuff. And so I was like, well, there's no real point in finding truth or searching for truth because you just can't find it. So that's where I was for years. But it's interesting because looking back, I started to have these intuitive thoughts that now I can recognize were coming from outside of me. I started to think of like, well, I do sort of live on because we live on in the memories of the other people around us. And so like having kids, they will remember me and I will have made an impact on me. So my essence will continue to live on forever. That was kind of one model. And then I also thought like, well, I'm also living on, by having kids, that's kind of a continuation of me. And then I was thinking from a materialist perspective, I was thinking, well, my atoms are just going to get recycled into the earth. And if I identify with my body, I am immortal because they're always going to be there. They're going to be incorporated to new life. And, I've got part of Caesar in me, because it's pretty interesting. I think when you look at, there's some things about how, somebody thousands of years ago, whatever, there's parts of his or her body spread around the world or whatever. And so I was like, yeah, when I get buried, I don't want to be in a concrete box because I want to go back into this cycle. And then I also remember one time thinking like, I think that this is like a tree where I'm a leaf on a tree and I will fall at some point and just get kind of recycled into the earth, but the tree will continue to grow. And so I started having these thoughts of like shifting my identity from the ego to a broader sense. And so it's interesting to look back and realizing that I'm starting to figure things out. And then, so, yeah, I had my friend Nathaniel who had left. I would chat with him over the years. He had kind of taken a slower, longer arc did a lot of nature stuff. When we were at BYU, he had a job where he spent a lot of time in nature with troubled kids and wilderness therapy. And then he did an energy school in Sedona and had a little stint as a practitioner doing some body work there, and had gotten into the festival scene and psychedelics and stuff. So we didn't talk too much about this stuff, but he was aware of these things. I remember talking to him very, very little about these things, but he was aware of that, and that helped me later on in my journey. So I guess that brings us up to about 2 years ago. I took a little break from working and we were doing some full-time RVing during COVID while we were in transit. We were going to move out of New York, and come to Portland, took a break off from work, and my ex-wife was working remote at the time. And, things are still, had been difficult in our marriage. And this is kind of a helpful period that really pushed us to figure things out. And so we ended up separating at kind of mid the plan for our trip. And that's where things really kicked off for me, because I'd gone a little bit in therapy over the years, but never really knew what I was supposed to be doing there. I didn't maybe have the best therapist. I did have a good therapist during that trip, where it started to ask some questions of me and help me figure some things out, and kind of go down the rabbit hole of ADHD and seeing how my brain was working kind of differently. But when we got separated, I started looking into like trauma, and because I didn't know anything about trauma, and I remember Googling trauma, and because I was like, it's not communication differences that are causing this. It's like, this is our childhood, and why do we see things so differently? And so I just went down this rabbit hole over the next several months of just binging this podcast by these two therapists. And it was very, very much attachment theory based, but they also introduced me to polyvagal theory and just autonomic nervous system regulation, and so many. It started to blow my mind about like, oh, this is why people view things differently, and started to understand trauma and how.
Yeah, sorry, the impact of our childhood on our life. And I think, many of the people that awaken start with therapy and start to understand why they behave in the way they behave, what happened in childhood, and how, has impacted them throughout their life. Yeah, so I think many of us start from there.
Yeah, and a big revelation for me was the shame thing when I realized like, oh, I don't love myself, and I don't feel like I am good, and I've just been carrying this shame for years, and was hiding parts of myself, because I was like, this is how I stay safe. This is the only way other people really like and accept me, is if I keep these parts hidden and show these other parts, and I'll work on those hidden parts until they're better someday, but that never works. So it really wasn't authentic. So I started sharing the things that I felt shame about with other people, and just had disconfirming experiences when people, I thought that they would look at me a certain way, and they're like, oh yeah, I had a similar experience too, and I felt the same way, and really brought me closer to people, and realizing like, oh, I can be authentic, and that's actually what connects me most with people. So really got into psychology, attachment, read this huge book on attachment that was really influential in my awakening. So in this book, this is Attachment Disturbances in Adults. It's by, I think, David Elliott and I forget the other author, but the one guy is trained in Eastern, in Buddhism, and it was also hypnotism, and it's also a psychologist. And so there were a lot of themes in the book. So it talked about basically stages of development in terms of awakening. It talked about metacognition, but it was like not just thinking about your thoughts, but it was like just essentially reality, and how if you blend all the perspectives together, you go from one perspective where you're just viewing one perspective and you think you see this right and wrong, and it's this moral absolutism, this is right, this is wrong, and then you see other perspectives, then you kind of go into the moral relativism. It's like, well, there is no right and wrong, or no truth, because it's all looks different from different perspectives. But then the more and more perspectives you get, then you actually converge back on like truth, absolutism again, because it's the sum of all the perspectives. So talked about that. And then also, another really key part of this book was talking about dissociative identity disorder. And dissociative identity disorder, or used to be called multiple personality disorder, was this idea, or this phenomenon that there's a person who has, they're one brain, they're one person, but due to trauma, they've basically separated off parts of their consciousness, and so they have different identities that are sometimes completely separate from each other, where they don't have any access to the other identities, memories, and they take over at different times. And so it was this model where you have one individual, but then they have these different identities within it. And so they had, in the book, they had an account, it was like 20-30 pages of this therapist that was working through, it was like transcripts of their therapist. It was really fascinating. This person had multiple identities due to this severe trauma growing up. And over a few years, all of those identities merged together, integrated into one. They healed the dissociative identity disorder, and they no longer had these different parts of themselves that were unintegrated. They didn't have dissociative identity disorder. So that was really fascinating to me. It's like that process and that concept. And so I also got really into nonviolent communication, which was really changed my perspective, because nonviolent communication is just this concept by a psychologist of, our language is built around these moralistic judgments, good, bad, good, evil, over, under type of stuff. And that we can move away from that and just view everybody as having good needs. We all have needs: safety, love, respect. We all have good needs, and we're seeking to achieve those needs. Some people are just doing it in very, very unhealthy ways. And so it just really broke my idea of good and bad and good and evil, and that black and white thinking. And that started to like unlock these. So this is where it starts to get weird. As I started, so separated at the time, I was going through a lot of shifts, changing jobs. And I started to have these experiences where I just was thinking my brain was thinking in a different way that it had never thought before. And everything was like so crystal clear in certain moments. It felt like my brain shifted to a different gear. And like everything made sense. But then I would move in and out of these states. And I noticed that they would happen. So it was something I'd never experienced before. I noticed it would happen. I'd like shift into this state. And then if like and it was usually if I was overcoming some fear or being vulnerable or leaning into something that used to make me uncomfortable, like I, was feeling some shame or vulnerability with somebody, and instead of like retreating, I would just be open and be like, hey, I'm noticing I feel worried, like I'm wondering if you're thinking this, and they, it would always bring the opposite of what I had feared would. And so as I overcame these things, these expanded states of awareness, consciousness were happening. But then if anything like came up of like fear, shame, if I started to worry like, oh, I'm like being stupid or whatnot, like instantly I would drop out of that state, and everything like became confusing again, and I would go back to where I was before. So it was really weird to be experiencing these things. I had a friend introduced me to Sam Harris's Waking Up app, and so I started listening to these meditations and doing these meditations that were really breaking my mind from its materialist view of I was just thinking about ego and the illusion of like being a separate self, and consciousness and non-duality. And so one night I was going to bed, and all of a sudden I started having these like contractions, Kriyas, I guess, involuntary Kriyas, you would call them, like my hands, my legs. It felt good, but I wasn't doing it myself, and I didn't know what was going on. And I don't think it lasted for too long, 5-10 minutes or something. And I was like, that's weird. Like, I don't know what that was.
A contraction in your body.
Yeah. And it was a little similar to like somatic experiencing, is this concept by Peter Levine of about trauma, and how he noticed that animals didn't get PTSD, even though they like almost got eaten by a lion. He saw that they would go and they would shake off and allow all those patterns go to completion, whereas like humans don't. We just sit at our desk and we get triggered, but then we just sit at our desk and we don't somatically release things. So it seemed sort of lined up with that. But very soon I connected to a Kundalini awakening, which was a concept I didn't know. So, and I'll get to that. But I also started feeling, so with these like shifts of consciousness and like really thinking in this much more fluid, crystal clear way, I started having this feeling of like energy, vibration, kind of going up and down. Well, I would feel it in my legs first. Again, something I never experienced before. Feel my legs, and then if like things were really going well and I was making sense of things and connecting with people, like over the few months that I had this, it would get to higher points, like my back or my neck. It was a good feeling. But I never felt it before. In Mormonism, they talk about like that the spirit talks to you by a burning in your bosom, which wasn't quite that, but there is some sort of concept of like a somatic feeling of the spirit. So yeah, I would have this, and again, it would, just like I talked about before, I would feel it, and then if anything, if I drop to like the shame, fear, or anything, like instantly that would be gone, and be out of that state. And it was interesting because I was talking to my mom about this. I processed a lot of things with my mom, and she's like, oh, that's weird because your dad had something like that, a feeling that would go up and down back in our, when we were first married, and he really like leaned into it, and he would like go out driving, and like depending on the feeling he would turn left or right or something, like really putting a lot of meaning into it. And so yeah, it was interesting that the more I talked to my mom, my dad had some experience in his life where he experienced a lot of these similar things that I was trying to experience. So I had that feeling going up and down. I also like just
Sorry,
I
just need to.
mhm.
So the feeling that is going up and down, could you describe it as waves of energy going up and down your body?
I mean, at this point, I still like had heard about people talking about energy, but I thought I was like, oh, these people, it's weird. Like, I don't know what I wasn't familiar with like the more what people would call woo stuff. But so energy, like, I don't know what that meant. It was like kind of a tingling.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to describe it. Buzzing, but it's starting the legs. And so I also started to need to sleep, much less. And so in like the height of this, there were nights when 2 hours of sleep and I was like perfectly rested, and I didn't have like bags under my eyes, and I wasn't like sleeping during the day. And the weird thing about this was I just felt really energized, and I just did not need to sleep. But if I started thinking about kind of these lower vibration, lower energy, so the way I thought about it at the time is like this: the amygdala, so kind of this reptilian brain versus the prefrontal cortex. So I was still thinking about it in neurobiological stuff. It's like, okay, we've got this older primitive brain of like fight, flight, fear response. And then we have this prefrontal cortex, this more evolved, newer brain that if, that's where we make this, we can think a lot better and have higher expansive thoughts. And I was learning, from my perspective, I was shifting over from this primitive brain, reptilian brain, to it's like higher states of consciousness. And it's maybe a little bit of a simplification, but it's generally viewed as like a seesaw where like, if you get triggered, you get into fight or flight, amygdala takes over and your prefrontal cortex kind of shuts down. And so, but then if you can start to get the prefrontal cortex online where you're like naming your emotions and you're like, oh, I'm feeling this is anger or this is sadness, then that amygdala kind of releases its grip and you're back onto the prefrontal cortex, and you can manage yourself better. And so that was how I would view it, as like it's kind of the shifting from primitive brain to prefrontal cortex. So with the sleep stuff, I noticed that, I was just energized and need sleep. But then if I started like getting in a rut of like worrying about, the divorce, we're getting a divorce now. If I started worrying about things, I would just suddenly get so tired. And I felt like I was just kind of slipping back into this. Yeah. And so it felt like, that as long as I could like stay in this, I started to view sleep as sort of this garbage collection of like the stuff we can't fully process during the day. We run out of the energy that we have for the day and we have to recharge. But like, if you can really think things at a higher, more expanded awareness, like you really need to sleep that much because you're processing things. And I'm talking to other people, like there's most people in their awakening, they go through a period where they're not sleeping much at all. And it goes back to normal for most people. And there's a corollary with like psychopathology stuff. I have friends that have bipolar disorder, and when you're in a manic phase, you don't need much sleep, but it's not sustainable. And then there's like a crash later, but I really wasn't having crashes. And it felt sustainable because I'm like, I'm just connecting with people and it's really energizing me. That was weird, of a couple months where I really just didn't much sleep.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I think something very common, like in the Western societies, those kind of things that you are describing, I don't know how many people can understand it that are listening here, but often are also confused with some schizophrenia or some other stuff like that. So yeah, we don't have, if you tell this story to someone in Asia, they would immediately understand what you're talking about. I think it's just here we don't have the framework for these kind of things. We will have them soon. They're already, but they will be more popular soon, I think. But yeah, so often I heard many stories, unfortunately, that people go to psychiatric hospitals because of things that you're telling. Yeah.
So, and then the next weird thing that's started to happen, well, wasn't the next thing, but another thing that was happening at this time was I started accessing these kind of bliss states, you would call them. Well, first of all, it was interesting to like, be listening to the doing the Waking Up app and realizing like, oh, like nirvana, enlightenment, that's like a thing, because I had no exposure to Buddhism, Hinduism, any of this stuff, and you hear about it, but it's so foreign to like a materialist logical perspective. But I started to realize like, oh, these are like, maybe they're not what traditionally they're viewed as, of like you reach a state and then you like poof out of existence, you're on another plane of reality. Maybe they're not quite like that, but like it's describing real phenomenon, trying to describe something real that like happens, that you can attain, that you can go towards. And so I started having these experiences of just like, bliss, of this like wonderful feeling. And it like,
Ecstasy.
it was, yeah. And it, to me, it felt essentially like this orgasmic sort of bliss, but not like in a physical way of just like, located around your genitals. It was like a whole body, like that feeling, but just like everywhere, and not related to like romance or sex at all. And so, and I think one of the first times that like I had felt that was after I started with a meeting with a therapist, and yeah, I just really opened up in the session, felt really safe with her, and was feeling, letting out emotions, whatnot. And after that session, I just felt like, yeah, just blissful in a way I'd never felt before, for hours, and it felt good, but it was also kind of scary, because it was like what if I lose this therapist, or what if, I don't know. I didn't know quite what to make of it. But I would start having this more and more often. And I was really researching a lot of different things, getting exposed to a lot of different ideas, Hinduism, Buddhism, diving more into psychology and neurobiology. And so I would be thinking a lot of these, making sense of things. And when I would draw connections or like have these aha moments, it would be associated when I was having these feelings, that, yeah, sometimes last for a couple of hours, which is like really, really blissful. Just, so yeah, there's feelings of just like love for everything. And it's funny. So I was processing a lot of the stuff with my friend Nathaniel, and he was like, these are really psychedelic thoughts that you're having, but you're not on any psychedelics. And so yeah, so very like, I guess what you'd call like stonerish thoughts. I'm like, what if the universe is this? But it was just coming naturally to me as I was piecing things together. But so a big part of this, or an interesting step in this. So I was explaining to Nathaniel when these weird sensations that I never felt before were happening. So I told Nathaniel about it, and he's like, I told him about this feeling that would go up and down. And he was like, I think you need to look into Kundalini awakening. And I'd never heard that term before. And so I was like, okay. And so yeah, did some Google searches, and I was like, yeah, this is really weird stuff, because I didn't know anything about chakras and energy, and that's not the way I viewed things, but it's talking about this awakening this latent energy that rests at the base of your spine, Shakti energy, the divine feminine, and like as that awakens, it goes up your spine, and it goes, connects with Shiva, which is in your head, and then that energy, if your chakras are clear, that energy goes out your crown, and you achieve this higher state of consciousness. But if any chakras are blocked, the energy goes out the side, and it can be very bad. And you'd hear, I would see stories of people like really disruptive in people's lives, because they have no clue what's going on. They can't manage these things happening. And so
kind of your dad for you was like that, right?
Yeah, and he ended up having, feeling at some point that he should have been the leader of the Mormon church. And so had, what I now know is like ego inflation, is you start identifying with, Carl Jung had a book, or did some lectures on kind of talking about Kundalini yoga, Kundalini concepts from a Western psychology. And he talks about how, this is, you at some point you start connecting with the impersonal, or like the universal, unconscious. But he's like, but don't identify with that. Like, that is not you. I mean, it is you in some sense, but you have to realize like that's not, be very careful, because once you start thinking people can start thinking they're God, and they're like, oh, I'm seeing all these crazy things happen in my life. Like, reality starts to bend. You see really weird things. Some of it's confirmation bias. Some of it's, you start seeing these spiritual experiences, synchronicities, whatever you want to call, having precognitive sort of psychic things happen. And then you start thinking that like, that's because of some special thing that you are. So there's a lot of really, really disruptive stories about being disruptive in people's lives. So I didn't dive too much into it, but it was very weird to see that I was going through something that like is a thing, and is like the basis of yoga. Is, it's not for fitness, it's to activate this type of thing. And so I didn't dive into it too much at that point. But I was having these feelings, and
Can you tell
Bliss
about
States, this feeling up in it.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's delayed a bit, the sound, but can you tell also about the colors and all these kind of things? I really like it.
Yeah. So there's the Bliss State. So it was more of a feeling. And then I started learning a bit about Hinduism, and this concept of like, oh, we're all essentially in God's dream. We're just different parts of like, quote unquote, God's mind that have kind of dissociated different parts of the dream. And we're just learning that all the other things that we come in contact are really us too. And like, that's the whole purpose of it. And so I was really leaning into that. Yeah, we're all one. Other people are mirror selves. And so it's feel like a lot of love for people, really easily connecting to this idea of like, oh my gosh, this is another part of me. And like, there's just this beautiful, really foreign concept to me. But it also made sense from a scientific perspective, because I knew about dissociative identity disorder. And so there were a few instances, this was at work, I wasn't meditating, wasn't doing anything. So these moments when one was with this assistant at work, where we were just talking about something and really connecting. We had a good friendship, and I was just really like leaning into this idea of like, oh, this is like another aspect, another part of me, this person, like we're connected, we're all part of this like loving one. And like I was just filled with this like love and this beautiful feeling, but also visually, like all of the colors started to like become more vibrant than I had ever seen before. And everything kind of went from like 720p resolution, like if you're on YouTube and you don't have a good connection, to like 4K, 8K, like crisper resolution than I'd ever experienced before. And she just became incredibly beautiful, but not in like a normal sense of like, oh, they fit the romantic, the standards of society of what beauty, but like beautiful in like a beautiful like photograph or painting of just like so it was just this actual visual experience. I mean, I didn't see anything that wasn't there, but this what aligns with what people talk about on psilocybin, of just like everything becoming more beautiful and crisp and clear, and then it was also accompanied with this love and connection, and it was like a deeper than romantic love. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I want to date this person or whatever, because they had a partner, but it felt like this deeper access to this core love that is platonic love. That's like the perfect form of it.
I would call it unconditional love. This is yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so this happened. This happened about 2-3 times. Just in these moments where I connected, we're talking with somebody, and it was really bizarre. Like, I mean, it's not just, oh, things look different. It's like it's a different state of consciousness that I'd never experienced before, and I didn't know what was going on, because it's just such a bizarre, beautiful state of being. And I was like, does this other person feel this? Like, what is happening with reality right now? And if you've taken psychedelics, it's easy because you just look back and be like, oh yeah, this is all happening because I took something an hour ago, and it's just messing with my brain, and in a few hours it'll wear off. But when you start have those things happen to you, and you didn't take anything, then it really wrecks your view of reality, and you have to like figure out like, how is this happening, especially if you're so logical and materialist like me. Is like, what is happening with reality? And this is the weirdest part of this, and I'm not sure exactly when it fit in, but there are also very difficult parts of this, of just like deep lows, pain, suffering, really stressful things going on with the divorce, and just job wise too, not knowing what the future was, and facing fears, really low points, and also very disorienting points too, because like my whole view of reality was breaking, and I was diving into these philosophical things, and so I remember, I started getting back into lucid dreaming. I tried a bit of it in my teenage years, which is just the concept of like becoming aware that you're in a dream when you're in a dream, and then you can like do cool stuff in the dream. And in this shifting, at one point I was like, well, maybe this life is really all there is. there's nothing after this life. This is kind of earlier on in the process. So I might as well unlock all the time I have here. So I'm going to get back into lucid dreaming. And you can do it by doing reality checks, meaning you're just training your brain to constantly question whether you're in a dream or not. So you look at some text during the day, you look away, you look back at the text and try to see if any of the letters change, because that happened in a dream. And so you're just, the goal is that you train yourself to constantly do this. And then when you're in a dream, hopefully you'll do it. And then you realize like, oh, I'm in a dream. And then you can do whatever you want in the dream and have, play around in the dream. So I was doing it a bit, and I also one night I was like, oh, so I was curious with lucid dreaming. I watched this movie, Waking Life, which is this trippy movie. It's like animated, and it's about, this was really early on in my awakening, and so I didn't really understand much of what it was talking about. But it's this guy that realizes he's in a dream his whole life, and he's like, has these false awakenings where he thinks he's waking up, but he's still in a dream. He's talking to other people, and it's a lot of philosophy stuff. And so I watched it one night just randomly, and I didn't get much out of it. But a month or two later, I was having a really, really tough time processing, all this stuff, philosophy, what reality is. And I remember like driving the car, and I was like, what is real? Like, am I real? These kids in the backseat, are they real? What's the nature of reality? Like, I don't even know if this is all an illusion. And so I messaged Nathaniel, and I was like, hey, I think I'm having an existential crisis here, like a little existential crisis. But I think it'll be okay. And then he messaged back a little bit later, and he said, definitely will be okay. And then I looked back at my message, and I saw at the end of my message, it said, definitely will be okay. And then he was just responding, yeah, definitely will be okay. And I was like, I do not remember. I don't think that I wrote definitely will be okay in that first message that I sent him. I was like, I have no recollection of writing that. I didn't write that. And it's really weird that it's in the message now. But that is like the message that I needed to hear. And so I set me on a trippy loop where I was like, this is essentially like a reality check in real life, quote unquote real life, that failed. Like, I looked back at something that I wrote, and it's different than what I wrote. And then just was like, what if life is a dream? And I was like, what if like quantum physics, like Inception, he has that little thing that he spins to figure out if he's in a dream or not. And if it doesn't behave the way that it should, he's in a dream. And I was like, what if quantum physics is our totem? That's what it's called. It's like, things in quantum physics are not behaving the way they should. And it's like trying to tell us we're in a dream. And it is just like stacked layers of dreams. And it was a very dysphoric thought, because I was like, oh my gosh, like life is a dream. And this is, this happens sometimes when people take psychedelics. It's called derealization, where you just like, you don't feel like reality is real. And it can be very, difficult and have really bad outcomes for people. And so there was this day that I was just like, oh my gosh, everything's a dream. All these people are just like, solipsism is the term, where you think all of reality is in your head and nobody else is real. They're all just NPCs. And so I was like, yeah, what if like everybody, they don't really exist, and they just kind of kind of are called up when I like call them, my brain is just like kind of creating this other person. And a very scary existential place to be in.
Yeah.
And I went to bed that night.
Just listening to it, I'm destabilized. I freak out
Yeah.
listening to the story. So yeah, I don't know how you did it, because I wouldn't be here if it would have happened to me.
I tried to call my ex that night because I was just like really destabilized, and she didn't pick up because I needed to talk to somebody, but I just went to bed. And in the middle of the night, I woke up thinking about this movie I had watched two months ago, this specific point in the movie. And so I like rented the movie again, like 3 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And I went to this spot in the movie that I didn't understand at the time. And the main character is like kind of realizing he's in a dream, and he's like walking along and he meets this person. He bumps into this person, this red-haired woman, and then they start to chat, and he's chatting with her, and she's telling him about this. She's writing this, she's putting on this play, and all the actors are like alter egos of each other. And while he's listening to this, he looks down at his watch and he sees like the text is all wobbly in the movie, and he realizes like, oh, I'm in a dream. And so he like looks back up at her and he's like, tell me what it feels like to be a character in my dream. And she's like, why do you think, why do you think I'm a character in your dream? She starts questioning his logic. And he's like, well, I know you're a character in my dream, because I forget, he's like, yeah, I know this is my dream. Like, I just realized it's my dream, and you're just like part of my brain, kind of like a host nation. And she starts saying like, well, like, tell me about yourself. Like, where do you live? What's your name? And you can't, in dreams, unless you have a really high level of lucidity, and there's a lot of research done on lucid dreams, you can't access these things. You don't know about your waking life's address or identity and stuff. And he's like, well, that's immaterial. So she's questioning his paradigm, and kind of pushing back and saying like, you think I'm a part of your dream, but like, you might be a part of my dream. And that's the next scene in the movie, is essentially like, well, everybody's not a character in your dream. You're also could just be a character in somebody else's dream. And so it was very interesting, because that's exactly what I needed to like get broken out of this derealization, this really dysphoric way of thinking. And it was, yeah. And so watching that movie, that little clip in the movie, it was also really weird too, because I had just become friends with CJ. Yeah, I had a new friend, and we had talked about a lot of these things, and she had lucid dreams, and really familiar with it, and familiar with a lot of these concepts. And she's like exactly this person in the movie, essentially red hair, green eyes. She's an actress, and this person's talking about like putting on a play, and also that character was talking about dissociative identity disorder, essentially talking about alter egos. And so it was just a really weird synchronicity of like somebody that I know in real life also really aligning with somebody in this movie, and this movie teaching me what I needed to learn, because I came out of that realizing like, oh, it's not a dream. It's not that the reality isn't real. It's essentially, it's kind of like these, you can view it as like stacked layers of dreams. Dissociative identity disorder, you can have a consciousness that also can be subdivided into little parts of the consciousness that don't know that they're connected with the other parts. but it's all part of like a bigger identity. And so that's a really, that's a model for viewing reality, is that we all think we're separate parts, separate from each other, but also we're part of a greater mental oneness. And this is idealism too, which I didn't really know at the time. But then also this idea of dreams and stacked dreams, and the movie Inception, I later realized like this is what Tibetan Buddhism teaches, is that life is just all these layers of dreams, and that we think we're separate, but then there's also like, you can kind of wake up from that, and then that person, that identity that's like a combination of this whole world, also is part of like another layer, basically a fractal view of the universe. And so I messaged Sage in the middle of the night. I was like, oh my gosh, like I get it. Like, it's not that it's all a dream, but it's not that it's a dream. Like, this is real, just not the real that I thought it was. I was still pretty ungrounded, but just kind of ran all these ideas by her. And she's like, yeah, I mean, it's real. So it was weird that I was like telling her some what I thought were really bizarre, weird concepts, and she's like, oh yeah, like that. Yeah, I mean, that's a way to view it. And so, I mean, that was like the peak weirdness for me. And then I was able to integrate it all into like a really see how these are all just different ways of viewing reality. And it's not that it's a dream. It's real. It's just, it's a different way of real than we thought it was before. And so there was a period of time where I went around viewing things really heavily from this lens of like lucid dreaming, and how this is all real, but there's a deeper layer of realness, and that things in this life are really scary, but we can view them like dreams, in the sense that it'll be okay. At some point we'll wake up, even if we die or whatever, like the worst thing that happens to us in this life, our deeper sense of self, our soul, the God mind, the oneness, whatever, like, it's also okay. And this is part of the experience. This is part of the process. And in dreams, and in psychedelic trips, the point actually is to not run from your monsters, but to hug them. If you see a staircase, walk up it. If you see a door, walk through it. Like, it's about facing your fears and
integrate your shadow,
unwinding your conditioning. Yeah, because these are all parts of you that you've cast off, and so I was still pretty ungrounded. Really leaning heavily
now,
on
listening
this.
to you and these stories.
Yeah, and for some people,
and
for some people, it's really, really destabilizing and really.
I get it.
So it's, I mean, it's, for me though, one, I had this idea, this like, this radical to me concept, this derealization. But I also realized like, oh, I didn't like figure something out about the universe that nobody else knew. Like, this is what Hinduism teaches. This is what Tibetan Buddhism teaches. This is what my friend says, like, yeah, that's reality. That's what it's like. And so I was integrated with other people and in a container where I could utilize it for my healing. And so when I was going through this really intense ego death in real life, of my marriage, my job, my identity, when something incredibly stressful and scary happened, I could just like step back and healthily dissociate a little bit and be like, oh, this is just a dream. What would I do in a dream if I like was lucid? I would just stay calm, know that everything's going to be fine. Like, it's maybe not as real, as I don't have to get as attached to this, sucked into this scenario as possible, but I keep that higher perspective. And then what would I do? Like, what would make sense to do in this situation? And every time that I did that, it was really weird. When I would do that and take that perspective, I would feel these like tingles throughout my body of, it felt to me like things were rewiring. I would get really triggered by something, and then I'd approach it or respond differently. And then I would feel kind of this somatic unwinding of things and rewiring of things. So there's another weird somatic feeling I'd never experienced before. And Peter Levine, the guy that started somatic experiencing, it's interesting. I was watching a video of his where he was working with a war veteran that had all these tics from being in combat, and he, like, his face would move and his jaw would move, and he would be remembering like bombs and stuff. And so Peter would say, okay, well, why don't you like move? Okay, why don't you fully open your jaw and move your head in that way? Like, move all of these things to completion. And then he's like, and what does that feel like for you? And the guy's like, oh, it's like this tingling. So he was essentially getting all these stuck patterns to finally go through to completion. And then the guy had some relief from it. So just some weird corollaries between, there's all these different models of viewing nervous system and reality and philosophy, but it was fascinating to see it connect up with all these different perspectives.
As I understood Kundalini awakenings, I work with energy, with Reiki and stuff, so you study a little bit of that. But basically, any emotion, thought, trauma is energy that gets stuck. Like, if you don't process it well, is energy that gets stuck in the body. And so with your healing, because you started to heal through therapy, you said you didn't mention it, but you did some breath work anyway, meditation. I think this energy was getting released from where it got stuck initially, with all the trauma probably that you went through, and that can reorganize itself and so flow in parts of the body. And maybe that is what you were feeling in your body too, with this tingling and the stuff that you were describing earlier.
Yeah. And I think, all these different perspectives and language, they're all insufficient, by themselves, but they're helpful and they're useful to use. And then also to hold them lightly too. But so, I switch back and forth between talking about astrology and energy and actual quantum physics and biological epigenetics and whatnot, because they're describing the same thing, and some are helpful in different situations and others in others.
Yeah, and for different people too. Some people understand more the scientific stuff, some other more the mind stuff, subconscious and superconscious and conscious mind, and some other more the spiritual stuff, spirits and energy and stuff like that. So it depends also how you are wired. You will understand. All these disciplines arrive at the same conclusion, but they start from different languages and point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the other, I guess, to wrap up, like the weird part of this.
Still not weird enough until now.
There were some other really weird stuff that happened in terms of, like, I started seeing, a lot of synchronicities. So synchronicities is Carl Jung's term. Religious people would call it spiritual experiences. Synchronicities, so just connections between things in the universe that shouldn't be connected that way, whether it's numbers you're seeing, or you thought of something and then the next day you see it, or you think of somebody and then that person calls you. I never had any of those experiences with religion, really. Very few. Some people have a lot of them, but it happened, there was a period where like it was happening very, very often. And looking back, I mean, some of that was like confirmation bias of like, oh yeah, like, I saw this and maybe I put more meaning into it than real, but others were just like really, really weird and impossible to dismiss. And so like, yeah, there's some weird stuff that went on. Like I did get a job, and it was weird that it ended up being like a chain of dental practices that were all based on like Buddhist principles. And so that was a fascinating connection. And I was there for a bit, and I would have experiences where I was just thinking of something, and then an email would come about that thing, or I thought I should like call this person, and then I called them, and they had just separated from their wife, and they were going through like this it's just weird things that looking back just I can't explain from like a logical perspective. I mean, again, from a logical philosophical perspective, but not from a materialistic perspective. There was one week where it was pretty bizarre, and that I started to have some like psychic precognitive things. So it's kind of the highest, deepest part of this. It was right before I went on a 7-day or several day silent retreat, and there were a couple instances that week that I had like psychic experiences. I was with a patient, and I was behind them, and I all of a sudden, like I knew that they were crying. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything because I was behind them, but like I just had this feeling, they were crying. And it wasn't like they should have been. I think we hadn't started doing anything. And then sure enough, like when I saw a few moments later, they had just started crying about something. And then another patient that week, I'd asked him, I was getting to know, I was like, oh, so what do you do? And then I instantly like knew that he was did something with physics. And he was like, oh yeah, I mean, some sort of physics professor or whatever. I just knew it like a moment before he said it. So I'm nothing mind-blowing, but just some weird, I never experienced anything like that. And then during that silent retreat, we had just met each other a few weeks before, I think. And I wasn't super good about what's that?
You mean?
Yeah. And I wasn't super good about the silent part. It's kind of hard to stay silent when you're going through a Kundalini awakening. So like we would text and talk when I came home tonight, because I didn't stay there. I was nearby. But there was this one, we meditate like 7 or 8 hours a day. So during this one sit, I started feeling this kind of newer energy feeling or whatever, pretty strongly. And I was like, okay, this is weird. This is new. I don't know what it is. And so I looked over at the clock, and it happened like 3 times, I think, during that hour. And so I just made mental notes of the times that it happened. And then I went over to my phone after, and those were like the 3 times to the minute that you had messaged me. And then it happened like, a few more times that day, and like the day or 2 after it, that like that feeling came. It was very, it wasn't like, I couldn't recognize it as like, oh, this is Vale thinking of me or something, but it was just showing that there is some access to this intrapersonal connection, energetic, whatever between people. I never developed it. I don't have mediumship qualities, but
sorry, yeah. No, wanted to say it happens to me all the time that I think about someone and they message me, and I'm sure many people have the same, and they message me a few minutes after, 1 hour after, or during the day anyway. So yeah, that's intuition. Yeah, that's psychic connection.
Yeah, and there were also times when I could get into like a channeling state or like a witness perspective. You know, people do Akashic records and channel different entities, but then there's also people that channel creative stuff, and they're not spiritual in any sense, but they're like, oh yeah, I wrote this book, but I didn't really write this book, it just kind of came to me. Or I mean, you look at people freestyle rapping and you're just like, yeah, there's no way that like the cognitive brain is putting all those things together. So this concept of like channeling, I view pretty broadly. For me, it would happen often when I was having like insights or talking to people about philosophical things, or particularly like connecting this with like the history, the origins of Mormonism, where I wasn't really thinking the words or it was just coming to me, and I could just kind of, I just kind of talked. But they also happened once, you and I both went to a festival, Arcadia, together, which was also a weird experience. One night I was talking to the and I was like, I think I want to go to a festival. And then the next day, this new friend that I just met, because I posted kind of a bit about my journey online, she sent me a podcast episode because she wanted to share Zach Bush with me, but it was an interview of Zach Bush with Aubrey Marcus. And at the beginning of that episode, Aubrey talked about Arcadia, and I was like, oh, I guess it's the festival that I should go to. So, you and I went to Arcadia, and that's how we met for service.
Yeah.
Well, I guess
I think this is a story for another time, though.
Yeah, but so that was a very cool experience. And so I was vibing high after that. Coming back, it was interesting. I got an Uber to the airport, and I was in this kind of like, expanded state of consciousness, just endogenously, like I hadn't taken any substances. It's just I had access to these states naturally. And I remember I got into the Uber, and I was just talking to the guy, and I just kind of knew what to say and what to ask him. I was just really focused on, like, it wasn't me. I was just kind of an open channel for whatever the universe, whatever he needed to hear. So we very quickly got into like his insecurities, how he felt about himself, and like his relationship with his family. And he's like, I've done things that I just, like feel so ashamed about, and like I want my family to like accept me, and that's why I do these things or cut my hair this way or whatnot. And it was just it was a new experience for me to like let go, and I wasn't thinking about what to say or responding, but I just knew what to say. So just this short ride, I was able to really connect with this guy and just kind of tell him, that, he had an inherent worth, and like, there's nothing that he did that, made him any less, and nothing to be ashamed about. And so connected with this random Uber driver. So, and those that doesn't come often to me now. So all this stuff like calm down and stabilize. I sleep a pretty normal amount at night, and I don't have that feeling really anymore, like the up and down, the Kundalini energy. Don't like have channeling much. I mean, when I get kind of I can definitely get into flow writing or talking about things. And you're laughing because I'm talking a lot here. But I do still sometimes have access to these like expanded states of just kind of bliss and really seeing these connections in the universe. I guess the last thing I'll share to kind of highlight that is so I'm a dentist. My degrees in undergraduate degrees in bioinformatics and computer science, no physics. While I was going through this Kundalini awakening, I started thinking a lot about entropy and thermodynamics and like the heat death of the universe and the Big Bang. And like I was like, something like doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't make sense that we're just going to a heat death where like that's depressing. I remember like walking around in the RV at the time, pondering this thing, but I couldn't really figure it out then. And then a few months ago, I started thinking about it again, and heard listened to a few different physicists talk about, and made some comments on entropy, and all were like clarifying or crystallizing these thoughts that I had almost come to like some breakthrough. And during this process, I would often like almost get to some conclusion, and then I would like read a paper or something somebody wrote, and it'd almost be like reading something from what future me would have figured out. It's like reading my own thoughts there, but just like in the future. And so had all these really profound insights on entropy, and wrote a paper integrating these different perspectives about how entropy actually is, and the second law of thermodynamics, which is the foundation of much of science. But it's been questioned at different times, but nobody successfully like challenged it. It's never been proven. So I wrote this paper about how entropy, or this idea that everything goes to disorder, isn't actually a fundamental property of the world or systems, but it's just a artifact of our limited conscious perception. And that, if we expand our awareness through meditation, psychedelics, these intuitive experiences, both individually and collectively as a collective consciousness, like entropy actually decreases, because we see order that's always there, but we just can't grasp it, and it looks like chaos. So I wrote this paper and submitted it to this Essentia Foundation group of scholars and scientists, and promoting idealism, and hope they publish it. But yeah, they ended up publishing it and then asking me to write a book on it. And then that was a few months ago, and then weirdly the other day, I hadn't heard anything since. So I was like, sure, I'll write it. It's cool to get published on something as a dentist and not my field. And then heard them talking about it in a video about how it's been like their most viral essay that they published, and they're really excited about this book, and it was retweeted by a couple pretty big scientists. So it's just really bizarre and cool to in like through awakening, through these states, like we have access to intuitive concepts and ideas that we that don't come from us, and that's how a lot of scientific discoveries and insights have come. So
cool to download random stuff from the universe. Yeah. I think, I can cut this out if it's not right, but this entropy thing that you explain in a very scientific way, which I don't get, and just to maybe some other people won't get it, but I think the way I can explain it is also throughout my life, that for a long time I thought everything was random and chaotic and I didn't see any reason for anything. But when I started to heal and awaken and learn about myself and reality, I could see that everything that was happening for a reason. So there was an order, there was some reason behind things. Is this what you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Because this applies both on like a looking back at your childhood,
Yeah.
as well as like somebody taking psilocybin and going out in nature and seeing like, oh my gosh, I see all the like ripples on the pond, and I see how actually everything is kind of mathematical, and it's like if we knew all the details, where all the atoms are or whatever, we could understand all the order out there, but we just don't have that grasp. We can't see it all at once, and so it just looks random to us. But so it's both like a
right. And psilocybin,
when you look,
people that don't know it, is magic mushrooms. So this is how I speak. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about our story and how we met, but think we can do it another time. And maybe we can talk about relationship in general, since I think we both learned a lot throughout those years, and maybe we can help some people out.
well, that's where I think a lot of the synchronicities that happened for us were in relation to us meeting, and just the weird experiences that happened through that.
The craziest part, we haven't told the craziest part yet. So I can keep it for another episode, maybe. Well, thanks again, Gabe. Thank you for sharing all of that. And thank you, everyone, for listening. If you're still here, thank you. And I'll see you at the next episode. Bye.